If we know that x cubed is 125, then we cube root both sides, and if we cube root x cubed, in other words raised to the power third, we'll have x. So we need to find the cube root of the other side. Appreciating we could write it like that as well. 5 times 5 times 5 is 125, so the cube root of 125 is 5. Now if x cubed equals minus 125, if we cube root both sides, in other words cube root the x cubed, will give us x. And if we cube root the minus 125, then we'll get minus 5, because 5 times 5 times 5 is 125, and minus times minus times minus would produce the minus. Okay, x to the power minus 3 means 1 over x cubed equals 27. Well, if we write that as 27 over 1, we can then say we'll invert both sides. In other words, turn both sides of the fractions upside down and get x cubed over 1, which is x cubed, equals 1 over 27. Now let's cube root both sides as we did up here, and we'll get x when we cube root the x cubed, and if we cube root 27 we'll get a 3, so that makes x equal to a third. X to the power minus 3 is 1 over x cubed, and that equals the minus 8. If we write the minus 8 as over 1, we can reciprocate both sides and say that x cubed equals 1 over minus 8. Now appreciate you can write that three ways, either with the minus at the bottom, or at the top, or in the middle. They mean the same thing. Now let's cube root both sides. The cube root of x cubed is x, and if we cube root the minus 8, we'll get minus 2, so the answer is minus a half. Before we leave this, let's just remind you of something else. If we raise to the power and to the power again, that's indices rule number 3. That's the same as multiplying these two indices together. That's a special case. And if you look at this, 3 times a third is 1. That could be useful. Let's look at a special situation here. If we're asked to find the square root of 25, if it's written like that, then they are actually saying what is the positive square root of 25. So the answer is just 5. If they require plus or minus in this question, then they need to write plus or minus in the front. So 25 raised to the power half is actually saying what is the positive square root of 25, and the answer is plus 5, if the question is written like that. However, if you're solving equations, we are going to find the square root of both sides. In other words, we're going to find the square root of x squared, and we're going to find the square root of 9. The square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 9 when we're solving an equation like this is plus or minus 3. So there's a subtle difference between what I'm doing there and what I'm doing there. Here I'm solving an equation. X to the power minus 2 is 1 over x squared, and that equals 9. Let's write that as 9 over 1, because then we can invert both sides and write x squared equals a ninth. Find the square root of both sides, so the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 9 is 3, so the square root of 1/9 is a third. But we're solving an equation finding the square root of both sides, so that's plus or minus. Now if x squared equals minus 9, then x itself, square rooting both sides, would be the square root of minus 9, which, let's just remind ourselves, we could write that like that, or we could write it like that. There is a little 2 there which we don't bother to write. However, you can't find the square root of a negative number, So we say that this has got no real roots, or no real answer if you prefer. We may look later into the situation where we call these imaginary numbers, but for now the square root of a negative number can't be found, and we say that it's got no real answer. Now this is saying x to the power half equals 4. In other words, the square root of x equals 4. To solve this I need to square both sides. So if I square this side and I square this side, I find x itself is 16. Notice that 2 times a half is 1. Okay, let's look at this situation. X to the power minus a half means 1 over the square root of x. So if I write that as 25 over 1, I can turn these two sides upside down and end up with the square root of x equals 1 over 25. To get rid of a square root, I need to square this side. Square a square root and you'll get just x. So I need to square this side. So we'll get 25 times 25, which is 625. X to the power half equals minus 9. If I square this side, I must square this side. The square root of x squared is x. Minus 9 times minus 9 is plus 81. X to the power minus half is 1 over x to the power half. In other words, 1 over the square root of x. And that equals minus 9. Let's write that over 1. So it looks like a fraction, the same as this side is. And then turn both sides upside down. So we get the square root of x equals 1 over minus 9. Square both sides, because if you square a square root, you get x. So here I've got to square this side, so I'll get 9 9s are 81. Minus 9 times minus 9 is plus 81. So x equals 1 over 81. Let's solve this equation. We've got x to the power 3 over 2 equals 64. Now the 3 on top is saying x has been cubed, and the 2 underneath means x has been square rooted to get this 64. And the order we do it doesn't matter. So to get rid of the cube, we'll need to cube root both sides. And to get rid of the 2 underneath, the square root, we'll need to square both sides. And the order doesn't matter. But if we square both sides, we're talking about working out 64 times 64. So let's cube root both sides. In other words, raise this side to the power a third, that will cube root it, and raise this side to the power a third, that will cube root it. So the cube root of this will give me x to the power a half, and the cube root of the 64 will give me 4, because 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. Now we need to get to the rid of the power a half, in other words, get rid of square root of x. To do that, we need to square both sides. If we square the square root of x, we'll get x. And if we square the 4, we'll get 16. Understanding these stages is important, but we can do it a lot quicker than that. Notice, using the third rule of indices, at this stage, if you multiplied those two fractions together, you would get a half. And if you multiplied those two fractions together, or that whole number with that fraction, you get 1. Now if I was to take the x to the power 3 over 2 and raise it to the power of 2 over 3, these two fractions multiplied together are 1. So in fact that will give us the answer straight away. As long as we do the same with the 64, raise that also to the power 2 over 3. In other words, square it and cube root it. Or cube root it and square it. So if we cube root it, we'll get 4. If we then square it, we'll get 16. Like all mathematics, it's better if you understand what's going on, not just know quick ways.